Today's subject is, well, it's one of the most difficult journeys we've taken on. We're looking at the effort toward truth and healing at former Native American boarding schools. It's a story of historical violence, yes, but it's also one of incredible cultural resilience.
A determined search for self-determination, and we're going to focus our lens on one specific place, the former Red Cloud Indian School, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota.
Right. For you listeners who might not know the deep history, Red Cloud goes way back. It was founded in 1888 as the Holy Rosary Mission. It wasn't officially renamed Red Cloud Indian School until 1969.
But what's really fascinating and kind of complicates the narrative right from the start is that its creation wasn't purely a colonial imposition.
Not at all. The historical record shows that Chief Red Cloud himself, the great Oglala Lakota leader, he actually advocated for a big permanent schoolhouse.
But his intention was
It was very nuanced.
extremely. He wanted a place that could teach literacy, give his people the skills for a changing world, but, and this is the key part, he wanted it to simultaneously preserve and sustain Lakota identity.
And the reality, as we now know, is that they went tragically off course from that original intent.
They did. The way the school was actually implemented, primarily by the Jesuit order, it got completely tangled up with the big federal assimilation policies.
The push to kill the Indian, save the man.
Exactly. And that partnership, well, it created this deep systemic trauma that we're still seeing the echoes of today, generations later.
And that trauma has forced a reckoning.
A huge one. We saw it on a global scale, especially after the just horrific discovery of mass unmarked graves at the former Kamloops residential school in Canada. That was May 2021.
I remember that. It felt like a turning point. It really was. It prompted the Midwest province of the Society Jesus, the Jesuits, to admit they had a crucial responsibility. They said they had to confront, atone, and strive for healing and transformation for the shameful actions.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try to be comprehensive. We'll start locally at Red Cloud, looking at the really remarkable cultural transformation that's happening there today.
Then we'll zoom in on a very specific, very high-profile forensic investigation on the school grounds. And we'll analyze the ambiguous and conflicting truths that it ended up revealing.
And finally, we'll zoom all the way out. We'll use the latest U.S. government reports to really grasp the absolutely massive scale of the federal Indian boarding school system.
And we'll benchmark the path forward in the U.S. against some of these global models for redress and genuine healing.
Okay, so let's start with the transformation that's happening right now, because this is really a story of proactive, self-determined change. And it starts at the most foundational level, the school's entire identity.
Right. The organization officially transitioned from Red Cloud Indian School to a new name, Maipia Luta.
Which is the Lakota name for Chief Red Cloud.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some, surface-level rebrand. It was a very intentional decision made after a lot of consultation with the Red Cloud family. The whole effort was to make sure the new identity didn't just honor their namesake, but that it actually reflected the organizational breadth they have today. They're much more than just a school now.
It really sounds like a deliberate reframing, asserting their own identity over that colonial legacy. It's a very public statement.
Oh, it is. When an organization with this kind of deep, traumatic history chooses to officially adopt a name in the Lakota language, that sends a powerful signal. It says the future is being defined internally by the community, not by these old external administrative structures.
And you can see that intentionality in everything, I imagine.
You really can. Even in subtle things like their marketing materials, the whole visual identity, the vibrancy of their color palette, it all speaks to this new chapter.
And alongside that identity shift is this really radical organizational change, one that puts the well-being of staff and students front and center.
You're talking about the 4-day week.
Exactly. They adopted a condensed 4-day work week for everyone, staff, teachers, and students.
Which is pretty remarkable in the context of American education.
I'll say.
It's inspired by modern ideas about productivity and fulfillment, sure, but on Pine Ridge, it's also, I think, an attempt to decolonize how we think about labor and schooling. It's a recognition that real growth requires balance, time for family, time for cultural engagement. All the things that were stripped away by that rigid, clock-driven structure of the boarding school era.
It gives the community back control over their time.
Yes, it empowers them.
And that idea of holistic growth, of well-being, it ties directly into their main transformative initiatives. And the most critical one is the revitalization of the Lakota language and culture.
Absolutely central. The Lakota language revitalization curriculum is at the core of their mission. It's comprehensive, K through 12.
And the data on this is really encouraging, isn't it?
It is. Studies are showing that students in this curriculum aren't just getting better at speaking Lakota, their academic performance is improving across the board.
Wait, really? Across all subjects? That's not just an anecdote. What's the mechanism there?
Well, the research suggests that when Indigenous students are grounded in their own language and culture, it strengthens their sense of identity. It enhances cognitive development, and it gives them this crucial framework for learning that actually validates their worldview.
So it's basically undoing the historical trauma of language suppression.
Exactly. And that leads to better outcomes in everything, not just Lakota class.
That's so critical, especially when you think about the history of kids being punished, brutally punished, for speaking their own language.
And beyond the classroom, they're investing heavily in the physical infrastructure of their culture. They're building the Hatku Arts Center, which is going to be the state-of-the-art heritage center. The grand opening is set for June 6th, 2026.
And this will build on their existing heritage center, which is already a big deal for the local economy.
A huge deal. It already works with around 300 native artists through art shows, gift shops, exhibits. They're actively creating these spaces where Lakaihote art and identity are celebrated, protected, and, importantly, monetized directly by the community.
But the revitalization efforts aren't just about art and language. They extend to sustenance, to autonomy, through their food sovereignty initiative.
That's right. And this started small. It was just a single geodesic greenhouse to teach students about gardening. But it's grown so much since then. Now they have multiple gardens, more greenhouses, even a chicken coop.
And the focus is on traditional Lakota foods.
Specifically, it's about growing and harvesting traditional foods, which connects right back to health and tradition.
Especially since traditional diets were one of the first things destroyed by the boarding school system.
Exactly. Reconnecting with traditional food is a critical part of healing the physical and spiritual damage done by forced assimilation, which often relied on, processed, unfamiliar, and sometimes just plain spoiled food.
Yeah.
It's about restoring self-reliance.
They're also seeing these incredible, measurable successes in higher education. Their alumni and graduate success program has produced some staggering results.
Staggering is the right word. If you look back to 2001, the college matriculation rate for their graduates was only 19%. 19.
And by 2009,
It had soared to 91%.
91% in less than a decade. That's not incremental change.
Yeah,
That is a complete paradigm shift.
it is.
That's competitive with some of the best prep schools in the entire country. How did they do that? What were the specific levers they pulled to get that kind of massive improvement so fast?
The report suggests it was a synergy of a few things. They definitely implemented excellent guidance counseling and rigorous college prep programs, test prep, application support, all of that. But scholars often point back to the concurrent cultural efforts. When students feel affirmed, when their culture and identity are validated by the school they attend, their self-efficacy, their belief in their own future, it just skyrockets. That cultural component gives the academic support program its power.
So all this positive momentum, the name change, the 4-day week, the 91% matriculation rate, it's all built on a very painful foundation, which is the necessary work of confronting the past.
And that leads us to the establishment of their Truth and Healing Initiative, which was launched back in 2019.
This is led by Executive Director Cecilia Firethunder.
Yes, and it's founded on a principle that is just so humble and profound. She said, "We can never authentically serve our community if we do not first openly and humbly address the tragic injustices in our past."
That requires total institutional transparency.
It does. And they've made a public commitment to working with Indigenous experts to making historical records broadly accessible. The whole point here is accountability. And like we said earlier, this commitment was dramatically reinforced after the Kamloops discovery in 2021. That really pushed the Midwest Jesuits to acknowledge their role and the need to atone.
And that commitment to truth, well, it paved the way for a very specific and very public investigation.
Right.
Which brings us right to one of the most visible and I think emotionally charged parts of Red Cloud's reckoning. We're talking about this specific forensic search for unmarked graves under one of the oldest buildings on campus.
Yes. And this investigation really put a spotlight on the tension between, cold scientific facts on one hand and the searing generational truth held by the community on the other.
The whole thing was set in motion by the account of one man, Justin Poirier.
A very brave man. He is Oglala Lakota, and he was both a former student at the school and significantly he was an employee there in the 1990s.
And what did he report seeing?
In the 90s, Poirier was working in Drexel Hall, which is this imposing 100-year-old building. It was a dormitory and also quarters for the nuns. He reported seeing 3 small graves, clearly marked with primitive wooden crosses, in a remote corner of this huge, dirt-floored basement.
Wow.
And he was told to stay quiet.
For decades. It wasn't until 2022, after Kamloops brought all of this to global awareness, that he felt he had to report it again, this time directly to the new school leaders.
In their response, the new leadership at Mafia Luda, it was immediate and appropriate. They didn't bury the account. They ordered an initial search using ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. That was in May 2022.
And GPR, for listeners who might not be familiar, this is a really crucial tool in what they call low-impact archaeology. It's central to the global search for unmarked graves.
Exactly. It sends these electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measures the echoes that bounce back. It's completely non-invasive, which aligns perfectly with the tribal value of not disturbing potential burial sites. And in this case, the GPR scan revealed possible disturbances. That's the term archaeologists use, anomalies under the floor. A floor which, by the way, had been covered over with concrete sometime after Poirier's sighting in the 90s.
So finding those anomalies was the scientific proof they needed. They had to move forward. They had to investigate.
Yes. So in October of 2022, they started a full-scale physical excavation. And the team they brought in was rigorous. It included forensic experts like Dr. Marcia Small, who is Northern Cheyenne and one of the leading experts in GPR technology.
Their team at Ohio Valley Archaeology.
Right. Plus members of the FBI and tribal law enforcement to ensure credibility, to ensure transparency.
I really want to pause on Dr. Small's involvement here because this investigation speaks directly to our focus today. I mean, how much truth and healing can this kind of forensic technology really bring? Marcia Small has made it her life's mission to find out at sites of Native American tragedy.
And her presence and the methods they used, it really speaks to that mission. The process was painstaking. The concrete was removed, the FBI set up a strict grid system, and the soil was literally hauled out bucket by bucket and sifted through meticulously.
So this wasn't some rushed dig.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was a deeply sensitive search for a definitive answer. And Justin Poirier himself, along with other community members, they watched the whole process unfold.
So after all that care, all that technology, all that emotional labor, what did the forensic team officially conclude?
On November 4th, 2022, Mafia Luda released an official statement. And it confirmed that no human remains were found.
No human remains.
Not in that specific location beneath Drexel Hall. The scientific analysis determined that the GPR anomalies were related to building products, specifically old mortar from laying bricks and, maybe surprisingly, to extensive rodent burrowing in the soil under the concrete.
And this is the absolute crux of the ambiguity. Science delivered a very specific negative finding, but that didn't erase the emotional conviction of the witness.
Not at all. Justin Poirier, the man who started this whole thing, he stood by what he saw. He stated it very plainly. I seen what I seen. And he then offered a speculation that the remains might have been moved sometime between the 1990s and when the investigation began.
And that just speaks to the deep, pervasive distrust that's rooted in a century of institutional betrayal.
Exactly. Dusty Lee Nelson, a citizen of the Oglala Lakota tribe, he put it perfectly. He said, "This is an investigation started by the organization that perpetrated the offenses. A lack of evidence in this instance doesn't mean atrocities didn't happen there."
Right. So the scientific outcome, even with outside investigators there, it couldn't fully quiet the skepticism about the power dynamics at play.
The fact that no remains were found in that one spot, even if it's true, it doesn't diminish the reality of the generational trauma that allowed a rumor like that to persist and be believed for decades.
And it highlights this vicious cycle.
It does. Both Poirier and Nelson emphasized that the trauma itself actively prevents many survivors from coming forward with their stories of abuse. They're afraid of negative reactions, of being disbelieved. Poirier said that many people came to him privately to share their own stories of abuse at the school, even if they couldn't confirm any deaths.
Which brings us to the really vital ongoing question of institutional funding for healing, especially from the religious order that ran the school.
This is such a powerful moment in the school's history. In August of 2022, the worldwide leader of the Jesuit order, Father General Arturo Sosa, who's based in Rome, he visited Red Cloud. And Poirier had this direct, profound interaction with him. He used the visit to demand action.
What exactly did he ask for?
He asked Sosa a very straightforward question. He asked if the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order could provide significant systematic funding for counseling services.
For those suffering from PTSD and the intergenerational trauma of attending the school.
Exactly. He was asking for a commitment that was commensurate with the damage that was done.
And what was the response?
So offered an apology for the order's complicity in the assimilation policies, and he promised to take the recommendation for funding back to the Pope. But Poirier's follow-up statement just underlines the failure to deliver. He said, "We haven't heard anything so far, though."
So the community, and specifically the new Mahpaluda organization, they're still shouldering this massive emotional and financial burden of recovery all by themselves.
That's the hard truth that Poirier stressed. He said the abuse went on for generations, and it shouldn't take generations for the Jesuits or the Catholic Church to correct the situation with proper funding and support. The forensic search, in the end, it didn't provide closure. It just confirmed the immediate active pain of the living and the urgent financial gap in addressing it.
It's incredibly difficult to hold the pain of Justin Poirier's story and the ambiguous truth of that one basement, without also acknowledging that he was just one person impacted by a system of 417 institutions.
Exactly. We have to understand the sheer, overwhelming scale of what the U.S. government built.
And this is where the latest official reckoning comes in. In July 2024, the U.S. Department of the Interior released Volume 2 of its Federal Indian Boarding School Investigative Report.
And it provides the most comprehensive, government-sanctioned data we've ever had on the scope of this assimilation program.
And the scale identified in Volume 2 is it's staggering.
It really is. The report confirms a massive network of 417 institutions spread across 37 states, or what were then territories. And beyond that, the DOI identified another 1,025 other institutions that were pushing similar assimilation goals, even if they didn't meet the 4 strict criteria used for the main list.
417 primary schools, plus over 1,000 others spanning nearly 150 years. I mean, that scope shows this was a national concerted effort. It wasn't just a series of local misfortunes.
Precisely. And the report attempts, however inadequately, to quantify the human cost. It confirmed that at least 973 American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children died while attending these schools between 1819 and 1969.
And we have to emphasize that at least. That is a minimum figure.
It is absolutely crucial to stress that. The DOI itself acknowledges these numbers are vastly undercounted. They were able to identify at least 74 marked and unmarked burial sites at 65 different schools. And while they managed to identify over 18,000 children by name who entered the system, the real totals for attendees, deaths, burial sites, it's exponentially greater. Many records, especially from religious institutions, are just gone or incomplete.
When you look at those numbers, the sheer number of institutions at the documented deaths, it really forces you to look at the financial commitment the U.S. government made to this horrific project.
And that commitment was immense. It was systematic. The DOI calculated that the U.S. government appropriated more than $23.3 billion, adjusted for today's inflation, between 1871 and 1969.
$23.3 billion in today's money, spent to actively dismantle Native identities, cultures, and families. That number is just shocking.
And even that figure is conservative. It doesn't include funds taken from tribal trust accounts, which the government often just dipped into without authorization. Nor does it include the vast sums spent by religious organizations that operated schools without any federal support.
So it was this massive public-private partnership aimed at cultural destruction,
backed by the full financial might of the federal government.
Let's detail that operational structure a bit more. It wasn't just a federal project. It really relied on religious organizations.
The investigation makes that entanglement crystal clear. At least 59 different religious institutions and organizations received U.S. government support land, funds, supplies to operate these schools. Out of the 417 confirmed federal Indian boarding schools, 210 of them, more than half, were operated directly by a religious institution.
That relationship is fundamental to understanding the whole policy. The government provided the mandate and the money, and the religious institutions provided the operational presence and the ideological framework for assimilation.
And the ultimate purpose of that policy, the DOI report, explicitly confirms this. It goes back to land and power. The assimilation of Indian children was, quote, intentional and part of that broader goal of Indian territorial dispossession for the expansion of the United States.
It was never about education. It was about removing children from the land to make the land easier to claim.
And this whole agenda often stood in direct, painful contradiction to treaties, to solemn agreements that were made before.
That's the deep irony here.
It is. The report identified 127 treaties between the U.S. and Indian tribes that explicitly included provisions for boarding schools or general education. So treaties that were supposed to guarantee protection were twisted into justification for the very schools designed to extinguish Native identity.
The boarding school system wasn't just a human rights disaster. It was a systemic violation of trust built on legal obligations.
Exactly. The 23.3 billion, the 417 schools, the 973 confirmed deaths. This is the devastating backdrop for the individual tragedy at Red Cloud. It was a massive, calculated national policy of cultural warfare.
So we've established the scale of the destruction, the depth of the history. Now we have to talk about the living legacy, the impact that isn't confined to history books, but is carried inside the bodies and minds of survivors and their descendants today.
This is where we move from history into hard, modern data, specifically through rigorous biomedical studies like the Running Bear studies. These are groundbreaking because they systematically quantify the link between boarding school attendance and adult physical health among Northern Plains tribes.
And what did this quantitative research find about the physical health outcomes for survivors?
The findings are just. They're impossible to ignore. Adults who attended boarding school reported significantly lower physical health status across the board. They had a 44% greater count of past-year chronic physical health problems, or PYC-PHP, compared to those who didn't attend.
44%. A 44% greater count of chronic illness. That's a massive difference.
And if you break it down by specific risks, the figures are even more alarming. Boarding school attendance was linked to, well, 3 times the likelihood of having cancer.
3 times.
Twice the likelihood of tuberculosis. A 95% increased likelihood of high cholesterol, an 81% increase for diabetes, and a 60% increase for both arthritis and gallbladder disease.
Just think about that for a second. This isn't just psychological harm. This suggests that the chronic stress, the malnutrition, the exposure to disease, the constant fear, it literally chemically altered the body's long-term response system. And that leads to dramatically higher rates of these severe, deadly chronic illnesses decades later.
That's the medical conclusion. The trauma produced stress that likely led to chronic inflammation, metabolic dysregulation. It accelerated the onset of these diseases. The body literally kept the score.
But the research also dives into the chilling reality of intergenerational trauma. It didn't just stop with the survivor, it was passed on.
It was. The studies found that a father's boarding school attendance was independently associated with chronic physical health problems in their adult children, a 36% greater count of chronic health problems in the next generation.
Why the focus specifically on the father's attendance?
Researchers theorize it might be linked to the increased incidence of physical and sexual abuse that men experienced in the boarding school system. That profound early life trauma can create deep psychological wounds that disrupt healthy parenting skills, which then leads to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, for their children. And potentially, this is still emerging research, but potentially epigenetic changes passed across generations.
And the context of ACEs for Native communities is already so devastating.
It is. American Indian and Alaska Native populations have significantly higher mean ACE scores compared to white, Black, and Hispanic individuals. It's a direct result of historical and systemic oppression.
And the boarding schools systematically targeted and destroyed the very things that could have acted as buffers against that trauma.
They did. Studies show that the key protective factors for Indian child health are distinct from non-Indians. Those factors are cultural connectedness, language, ceremonies, cultural values, and family connectedness, strong parent-child relationships.
And the boarding schools intentionally attacked both of those protective shields.
Right. Now let's bring in the human cost through the testimony from the Department of Interior's The Road to Healing Oral History Project. These are the voices of the people who endured it.
The survivors' testimonies, they paint a harrowing picture of constant physical and psychological control.
Absolutely. They recounted being immediately stripped, their hair being cut, a profound cultural and spiritual violation, and being forced into uniforms. Food was a massive source of trauma. They talk over and over about being forced to eat processed, spoiled, or just unfamiliar food. A direct assault on traditional practices where food is medicine.
And they weren't treated like students, they were used for labor.
Correct. So many of them shared experiences of being treated like a hired hand, forced into heavy physical labor, hauling brush, working in gardens. One survivor shared the chilling comparison that his military boot camp was no match. He said it was very easy compared to the boarding school.
The control was just absolute, right down to their movements.
The constant surveillance, the marching, the incessant ringing of bells. A descendant shared this powerful memory of her mother years later when the school bell was finally silenced. She felt this profound relief and she said, "No more will that bell ever tell me where to go, where to be." That bell was a symbol of captivity.
And the loss of language, the cornerstone of culture, was enforced with just brutal punishment.
The testimony about language loss is heartbreaking. Speaking their native languages meant severe punishment, or the common practice of having their mouths washed out with lye soap
Lye soap, a caustic, dangerous chemical.
or harsh detergents. The trauma was so deep that many survivors later in life actively withheld their native language from their own children out of fear.
One Montana participant lamented that he would never have the privilege of having a dream in Salish because the trauma forced his grandparents to silence their language.
And the absence of love, of affection, that's what created the intergenerational disconnection.
Descendants shared that their parents and grandparents were often emotionally detached.
Right. They weren't the loving, affectionate parents they wished they could be, simply because those formative years, the years you learn how to bond, how to give and receive love, how to hug, those years were stolen from them.
There's one recollection from a Minnesota participant that's particularly devastating about self-worth.
Yes, she recalled being told, "I was told I wouldn't make a good mother. In boarding school, you're not a person. You're not even a human being."
That psychological torture, combined with the constant religious threat that you're going to burn in hell,
Yeah.
inflicted severe spiritual trauma.
One Montana participant shared that it took him 40 years to put my feet back on the ground and stop believing in Christ and the Lord of the Holy Spirit. He said it required a full return to traditional ceremonies, like the Sundance and Sweat Lodge, for true spiritual healing.
And this psychological scarring, it's now being studied scientifically. The very nature of traumatic memories seems to be different for survivors.
It is. Emerging research on PTSD suggests that traumatic memories are qualitatively different. Instead of being stored and processed as a coherent story in the hippocampus, the brain's main memory organizer, they function as intrusions. They're located in the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC.
And what's the significance of the PCC?
The PCC is usually involved in internal processing, self-relevance, things like that. When a traumatic memory is processed there, it means the memory isn't filed away as something that happened in the past. Instead, it is relived as fragments of prior events, subjugating the present moment.
So for a boarding school survivor, the past is literally always present. The trauma isn't just a memory, it's an active neurological experience that can be triggered at any moment.
And that correlates directly with the chronic stress and physical illness we just detailed. The science validates the profound depth of the suffering, and it reinforces why the solutions have to be comprehensive, addressing health, spirit, and memory.
So given the scale of this system, the $23.3 billion investment in its creation, and the profound, quantifiable depth of the trauma, the path forward just can't be small or incremental.
No, it has to be a government-level response that's commensurate with the devastation.
And that is precisely the framework that Assistant Secretary Brian Newland provided in Volume 2 of the DOI report.
He presented 8 bold, comprehensive recommendations, and he stressed that action has to be paired with truth. These are the proposals designed to finally begin meeting that need for healing.
Let's start with the non-financial but necessary step. The formal apology.
The first recommendation is a formal acknowledgement and apology from the U.S. government for its role in forced assimilation. And critically, a formal repudiation of forced assimilation as a national policy. It's about rectifying the ideological and moral offense first.
But the core of the recommendations is financial. It directly addresses that $23.3 billion spent on cultural destruction.
Yes. Newland proposed investing in remedies on a scale that is, at a minimum, commensurate with that historical investment. And the proposal says the investment has to focus on 5 interdependent areas designed to build back what was destroyed.
And those areas are foundational to healing.
They are. First, individual and community healing, addressing ACEs and trauma, and making sure services are accessible even in urban Native communities. Second, family preservation and reunification.
Repairing the damage.
Exactly. Third is violence prevention. Fourth, redress Indian education, which includes properly funding the Bureau of Indian Education. And fifth, language revitalization, recognizing that language is the primary protective factor against trauma.
And this isn't just about money, it's about physical and symbolic acts, too.
Yes. The recommendations include establishing a national memorial, so this history is never forgotten, and actively identifying and repatriating the remains of children who never returned, and also returning former federal Indian boarding school sites back to the tribes.
And finally, Newland stressed the necessity of telling this story to the world.
He recommended telling the story of the schools to the American and global community, ensuring firsthand accounts are shared, and that all this information is made fully available for more research into the health and economic impacts.
When you look at the scope of these recommendations, it's pretty sobering to benchmark them against concrete actions taken by other nations with similar histories, like the CNZUS states.
Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Right. And the contrast, especially on financial commitments, is illuminating.
It really is. Canada, for example, has undertaken massive financial settlements for its residential school system. Back in 2006, they had the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement valued at $2 billion. That included a common experience payment of $10,000 for every survivor, plus more for subsequent years, and $125 million for healing programs.
That was a huge step. But their commitment didn't end there. We saw an even more staggering settlement just recently.
December 2023. A colossal $43.34 billion settlement.
$43 billion.
And that was specifically to compensate First Nations children and families who were harmed by the discriminatory underfunding of their child welfare system, a system directly linked to the legacy of the residential schools.
I mean, that figure, $43.34 billion, is directed at compensating the victims of systemic generational harm. It just dwarfs almost any historical settlement in the U.S. context.
And of that money, $20 billion is specifically for long-term reform of the First Nations Child and Family Services system. They aren't just compensating the past. They are funding change for the future.
Australia also established targeted redress for their stolen generations.
They did. Their Territories Stolen Generations Redress Scheme from 2021 provides a $75,000 recognition payment and another $7,000 for individual healing for those who were removed. It's a recognition that financial redress has to be paired with individualized support for recovery.
And both Canada and New Zealand have focused on legal protections to stop this from ever happening again, strengthening Indigenous authority over child placement.
That's right. Canada enacted Bill C-92, which affirms the rights of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis governments to exercise jurisdiction over their own child and family services. It parallels the U.S. Indian Child Welfare Act.
It's also worth noting the institutional response from the Catholic Church globally.
Absolutely. In July 2022, Pope Francis officially apologized on behalf of the Catholic Church for its role in Canada's residential schools. He called it a disastrous error and humbly begged forgiveness. That's an institutional apology that carries significant spiritual and political weight, and it provides a global standard that U.S. religious orders can be measured against.
Finally, let's circle all the way back to the technology that started our conversation. Ground-penetrating radar. When you look at the Red Cloud investigation and the broader need for healing, GPR's role isn't just about finding graves. It's about a new way of doing science.
It fundamentally is. Using GPR, like the work of Marcia Small, is a non-invasive tool that perfectly aligns with tribal preservation values of avoidance and minimal disturbance. It's low-impact archaeology that respects the integrity of these sites.
So using GPR in this context isn't just technologically advanced, it's a political statement.
It absolutely recasts Native American tribes and communities as pro-science. It shifts the entire conversation away from that old binary of Native Americans versus archaeologists who just want to dig. The debate now becomes less invasive research versus more invasive research. It allows communities to get scientifically rigorous information in a culturally appropriate way. GPR becomes a tool of self-determination and healing, not of trauma.
This deep dive began with a very localized, intensely emotional search for physical evidence at Red Cloud. It was driven by the brave testimony of Justin Poirier, and the investigation, in its ambiguity, ultimately reinforced a far broader and more difficult truth. The systemic damage done by forced assimilation is still very much alive.
And true healing, as defined by Assistant Secretary Newland's recommendations, and as we see in the monumental actions taken by Canada, it requires far more than just forensic investigations. It demands that commensurate financial investment matching, or exceeding that $23.3 billion, and it demands comprehensive policy change and real institutional apologies backed by actionable support for language, family, and health.
So the forensic search at Red Cloud, while it found no graves in that specific location under Drexel Hall, ultimately confirmed something far more pervasive and difficult to erase.
The real, tangible tragedy of the boarding school system isn't just in the unmarked graves we seek in the earth. It's in the chronic physical and mental health wounds carried by survivors and their descendants every single day. The deepest secrets buried by this system are the generational traumas still actively relived in the present moment, manifesting as higher risks for cancer, for diabetes, for PTSD across entire communities. That is the truth that requires the $23 billion response.